So there might be a little bit of a buffer here. Okay, we're live. They're probably like already listening to this. So,
hello, if you're listening to this.
Hello, we should be live now.
Okay, great.
Hey.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again on a Sunday afternoon. I'll just start with an acknowledgement of country. We're streaming from the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people. We acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded and that this always was and will be their land. And if you're not joining us from Yagara or Turrbal country, we encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge where you're joining us from and who that land belongs to. We are joined by one of our favourite people ever.
Yes.
This is Paul Andrew.
I would like to say that Paul is the reason that Viva still exists.
Yes.
I'm sure there's many other reasons.
No, he was the reason because we all got burnt out at one point during COVID after we first started, and it was the first time I had met Paul, but I just ran into him at Stable Art Space, and he was just enthusiastic about what we were doing, and he very expertly picked apart the perfectionism I was having in my head because I had got into this space of like, I can't check the email, what if there's something important in there? And it had been like over a year since I had checked the inbox. And he did a little, doesn't have to be that way, you can like do things on your own terms and really like remake it how you want to make it. And
Yeah, I think we had that
was
conversation
amazing.
in the rain.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it was really, it was a great opening, wasn't it? Simone Hine did an archival work actually, and yeah, we talked. Yeah, it was really good to meet you because that thing when someone's opening up about something, and it was just like I was very mindful that you needed to talk.
Probably did.
But yeah, you gave us a pep talk.
Yeah, gave us
told
a
us
pep
it was
talk.
worthwhile doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
now we're
wonderful. Yeah, and the Beaver chats are a really important part of what you're doing, and this sort of conviviality, on the couch in your
Yes.
home, is really important. And thank you for tuning in.
So, if you haven't read the description of the event, I'm just going to spruik Paul for a second.
Yes.
They are incredible. They run ARI Remix. Remix ARI? Yes.
ARI Remix, yep, exactly.
So that's an online resource, which is at remixari.org.
Remix.org.au.
Yeah. And if you haven't been to that site, you should, because Paul has very diligently archived ARI activity in Brisbane and Queensland from the 1980s through to now. So there is like 5 decades of content
info
on that website, and a lot of the somewhat ephemeral activity of ARIs, like their pop-up shows, they're only on for a night, they get quite small exposure and not a wide reach. Paul's work is really integral to a wider reach and preserving that history that doesn't last very long in physical spaces, but can last on digital platforms and in the form of zines for when digital fails. So Paul also runs EXTRA Zine, which is a anthology of memory that kind of documents the people's memory of ARIs. Am I doing this justice?
Yeah, absolutely, you are.
And he's run a bunch of ARIs, and was also a member of the Queensland
Artworkers
Alliance, which used to be our union. So if you're wondering what happened to all the support that used to be provided by the union, it did get dispersed into other organisations, but it is quite hard to know how to navigate that as an emerging artist. There's not a central peak body anymore, which we're keen to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, that's Paul, and he's one of our favourite people.
Friend of the ARI.
Well, like you look at your experience now, like with what you have done with Artist Run Communities of Practice for, quite some time now. and that knowledge that you've accrued through that period of time, and sharing that knowledge through Viva chats is really important. I guess as a sort of a prompt, we at the IMA Market Day last year, we were chatting about everything under the sun that day, that wonderful day at the Beaver stall, and I was saying to you guys, I often get asked about how to start ARIs, and then we sort of unpacked, I guess, what we probably unpack a bit more today, but that idea of I remember, I know what it's like to be. I was in 1984. I was 16. No, I was 20. Sorry, I was 20. And that's when I was like, no, I need to start something because nothing exists. Very different time to now. Pre-internet, obviously. But like there was a couple of things happening in the early 80s which continued in some way, but they were very different to a more, what I call increased coordination, where there's a more explicit way of organising around something rather than being very ad hoc. Nothing wrong with ad hoc, but that's sort of what I was interested in. So I know what it's like when you don't know. There was a young person contacted me on the Facebook page, one of them that I run, and they were saying, I want to start an ARI in Ipswich and I don't know where to begin. It's like, what do you say to that?
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in what you would say to that, because I think I don't think much has changed. I think in terms of starting an ARI, except I think the one really key point of differentiation is that now we have the internet. So in a sense, artist runs for a very long time, 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s, we're still doing the same types of things, having zines, newsletters, mailing the subscription mail outs, everything was sent through the post, blah blah blah. But keep in mind that Web 1 was read only, so Web 2, which we've got, thank God, is networked, it's participative, it's contributive, whereas Web 1, satellite space is an example of an ARI in the 90s, and then the farm is another one, a bit later on. And, you'd go there to find all the information and the programming, but you couldn't actually, do what we do now, where you send messages to, just keeping an eye on things as they come in. And so, but I think starting an ARI is the same thing, and of course then it begs all the, a whole bunch of other questions. And I guess that's what today's about.
Yes. How to start an ARI.
Also, shout out to Amelia for again doing an incredible job with our tech, and for our new upgrade to high definition streaming, so that you can see us all a bit better.
High def. I do like lo-fi.
We picked the wrong guest to start the
No, not at all.
With like a tape recorder, and
So
record the tape and then live stream the tape recording.
So when you say high def, what does that mean for you with the Beaver chats, if I can ask?
So in my perspective, creating high definition means it's gonna last longer on people's taste. Have you ever gone to watch a black and white movie and then you're like, actually I thought I would like this black and white movie, but I need colour.
Yeah.
Are we trying to professionalize? Is that what the high def is doing?
No, I'm thinking archivally.
Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking this is a better definition, so people can come back later on and go, oh, this speaks to my aesthetic of what I need for enjoyment of a thing. People enjoy a high quality thing compared to a lower quality vibe. Except for Paul.
You can send
nostalgia.
No,
Yeah.
I like both, and if you want to send Amelia a message about that we'd welcome you.
Send me something.
So let's gather some data while we're here.
Yeah.
But yeah, also mentioning the stream, our comments section is live, so if you want to jump into the chat and talk to us, Amelia will act as the voice of the people, as they do best.
Sorry for the voice.
So coming back to how to start an ARI, and I guess the good of ARIs, I really liked what you said earlier about you started ARIs because there wasn't anything else, and I think ARIs are definitely born out of necessity, and I think what constitutes necessity can shift as well. I think as we endeavour to make art more inclusive and accessible, ARIs play a huge role in filling the gaps of institutions. If there's artists that aren't being represented, or if your community wants to have a dialogue with an audience that isn't being platformed, you can become the platform. So yeah, I reckon how to start an ARI first, like feel the urge to do it and fill the gap.
And I think it's like the magic of ARIs is that you can make it whatever you want. Like I think often back to Clutch Collective, who just rented a truck once every month or few months, and everything happened with a truck. Like that was their space. So yeah, you can really think like super outside the box with it. And I mean, that's actually kind of necessary now too, because I think spaces are disappearing, like just third spaces or blank spaces, under the house spaces and things. I mean, in Queensland, I think like the architecture of the Queenslander house facilitated so much ARI activity underneath the house. And that's changing, like I think especially with gentrification, and you know, it's less easy to hold events with a certain number of people just underneath your house anymore, with neighbours that are going to call in noise complaints and things like that. So
renting's getting more precarious as well, so any complaint from neighbours to your real estate about people being at your house to see art carries a much higher risk than it did when we were doing ARIs, which were very focused on physical space. But I think like as a result, we've seen a lot of ARIs operating at the moment that take a different approach, less focused on space. They might be platforms for voices, they might be focused on online publishing, or they might be modular and satellite in modes of operating, so they'll just pop up wherever. Or they might be like us, who don't pop up very much but work one-on-one with people.
We're very behind the scenes ARI.
Yeah, but the thing that I like to emphasise is, but the conversations, the storytelling, the recollections and the dialogue doesn't stop. And my experience is, you know, now over 4 decades, that it doesn't stop. You know, you might lose contact with, you know, maybe there was a bunch of artists that was part of your cohort with the laundry, and they might disappear and go off and do their own thing, but then they reconnect later on. You know, like in 10, 20 years' time, you'll be like, oh, now I know what that guy was talking about. You know, and that's my experience, is that that's what happens. And often, you know, there is also show and tells, like, oh, look what I found when I was cleaning up. Look what happened when I threw out the shoebox. I'm glad I didn't throw out the shoebox. You know, wow, that sort of stuff. Oh, remember when we made that? It's like, and then suddenly all these memories come flooding back. And I think that's why I'm really interested in artist ephemera, because I think artist ephemera is, it doesn't matter whether you're making ephemera, as it's often called in literature now, where you're doing, you know, say what you're doing with your promotions and marketing and information, distribution about what Beaver's doing. You can still collect that, you know. And so I think that, you know, I think it's really important to collect that, because one of the good things about ARIs is there's nothing quite like them. And as you say, Noam, they evolve because of necessity. And I think it'd be good to talk about, you know, what some of your other, what you folks feel, because when people ask me, how do you start an ARI, and in a conversational setting, I would often say, well, what are you up against? You know, what do you feel? What do you want to trouble? What do you want to complicate? And how can you transform that through some sort of artist run activity, or indeed through your independent practice? And then that gets people thinking, because it's like, oh yeah, what am I up against? I mean, so when we started in 1984, the IMA, we were very lucky that Peter Cripps, who was the artist director of the Institute of Modern Art at that time, 1980. Let me think about this. 1984 to 1989, something like that. Peter came out to my studio. He was looking at this work that I was making. I was making queer paintings, but I was trying to hide the fact that there was, lots of homoerotic love going on. I was very young, but sometimes I wouldn't hide it very much. And anyway, he came into my studio and he was like, oh, and I think, and he really liked what I was doing. In fact, as it turned out, and I was saying to him, yeah, but there must be. I didn't know anyone. I was working in absolute isolation. Yes, I'd been involved with artist groups and cooperatives in the 1970s, and I had been involved with much older people, but I wasn't really connected with people who were my age or a little bit older again. And so I really wanted that to happen, because I was very lonely. actually. And I was trying to come out, and I didn't know how to do. How do you start an arts group? I didn't know how to do that. I didn't, in those days, coming out was very different to coming out today. In Queensland, that is. And so Peter was just really, he actively listened. He really liked what I was doing. In that same year, 1984, I'd managed to get myself overseas. I basically ran away from home to come out because I thought the only way I could come out in Queensland was to get out of here. And so I did, and I lived in London, and I lived in Paris, and very, very meagerly. And then I came back after about 4 or 5 months, and I'd seen what was happening overseas, and I was like, we need to do something about this here. And so Peter organised a meeting, I think it was in August 1984, and all these people came. And then in January we found a space and we moved in. And so everyone was sort of saying the same thing, like, there's nowhere to go. There's nothing. I mean, yeah, the IMA is great, and it's wonderful it exists, but it's very formal. It's not like where you go to hang out and have conversations like this.
Yeah.
About, what matters, what doesn't, what are the challenges, how are you feeling, what's going on for you, what's it like to be in your shoes today? What's going on right now for you? And of course all that stuff happens at ARI. So it was really, and Peter championed that. John, at the end of the meeting, artist John Wallace said, Peter Cripps, being a provocateur, said, so where's the next meeting? To just promote that independence, I guess. And John Wallace said, I could host a meeting in Morton Street in New Farm, and then the next series of meetings took place there. And then John, Waller, Diane Heenan and myself got in Diane's little Renault, old Renault, and Bommy Renault, and we drove between nearly every suburb and inner city suburb of Brisbane finding space, and we found a space thanks to an architectural cooperative that was in Charlotte Street. And then, of course, then a whole lot of things it was a real starting point for a whole bunch of other spaces. And so I think that's the thing about, how do you start an ARI? It's like, well, what sort of starting point do you want? What are you up against? What are the necessities? What do you need? What do you value? How can you transform those things through artist run community, a practice sort of scenario, and in your own practice, and maybe you can see artist run activities as a part of your practice. And some artists do see that, and others don't.
Yeah.
Some see it as something separate,
Yeah.
and I don't think that's changed.
Yeah.
I love, what are you trying to trouble? What are you trying to, what was the...
Complicate.
Complicate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Trouble and complicate things. I love that so much.
Well, that's queer and feminist thinking, and the same thing, yes, I'm working archivally with a community archives mindset, but it's, I mean, everything, I don't know any ARI in in Queensland that works with institutions in a formal, sort of coalitional partnering way. I don't know of any. I'm not saying they don't exist, but I don't know of any. I don't think that's ever happened. I mean, yes, there's mentoring, there's support, there might be some cross-promotional stuff, and a little bit of coordination around panels, discussions, and maybe exhibitions and things, but those things are very rare. In fact, I'd love someone to do like a master's or doctorate on artist-run exhibitions in Queensland institutions, because there's probably maybe 8 or 9 over 50, well, since the 1940s. They just don't exist. Very different to Melbourne. Melbourne, oh my God, storefront, all the artist runs in Melbourne, the Monash Museum of Art, there's been so many exhibitions, Gertrude Street, and similarly in Sydney, Imperial Slack's subject of exhibition that I can't think of the name of now, something come to me. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that in Queensland, unlike New South Wales and Victoria, that's mainly where it's happened, and a little bit in Tasmania too, there's not exhibitions around artist run activity. And I think that really indicates lack of value not from us, but from institutions.
Why do you think that is?
Great question.
But if you could think of something.
I think it's really complex. I mean, it's like, so you look at the support that you, in your experiences working with ARI, so I'm sort of answering this in an indirect way, Amelia, like you have support from artists, that's just like, that's a no-brainer. And it's like, it's amazing. You know, I think it's tied into a question like, well, why do ARIs, why do they persist? Why do they keep mushrooming? Why do people reiterate them? You know, why do you go from next door ARI to records? Why, you know, and you probably go to, and you know, now you're in BVAA as well. Like, so that iterative, that, you know, that recurring element to ARIs, it's fascinating. You know, I mean, if I was maybe younger and had a bit more energy, I'd probably look into it. But I talk about these things because these are really important questions.
Yeah.
And in relation to your question, you know, support structures are there, but how dialogic are they? How active are they? Yeah.
Speaking of like institutional support of ARIs, I think it's interesting to like draw a line between what is artist run activity and what is institutional activity, because often artists work within institutions, but from my personal experience I found like my ways of being and ways of working changed drastically depending on the role I was in. So when I work within institutions, I really, although I'm an artist, I don't feel like I'm practicing as an artist in that institution. Like an artistic approach, like you said, troubling things and complicating things within like my professional life as an arts worker isn't encouraged and doesn't flourish to the same extent it did when I was running an artist run initiative. And what we were able to do in the freedom we were afforded working in a deinstitutionalized way did so much for my development as an arts worker, and then it doesn't get adopted. And I find that interesting.
Sorry, just to clarify, no, when you say doesn't get adopted, in what sense do you mean? Doesn't get adopted by someone else, by an institution?
Yeah, like I think it's a huge conversation about why it doesn't happen, but I think like troubling or querying or complicating your ways of working isn't encouraged in an institution because they need to be efficient and productive and all of those sorts of things. So your ways of working change drastically. Like,
I mean, you have far less power. You're in a literal power structure.
Yeah.
And you're somewhere in the middle of it. It's kind of what we talked about in the last live stream. It makes it way more difficult to do all of that.
It's true, no. Yeah, sorry, sorry to interrupt, Marie. So I was just going to say that, you know, sometimes I say, when I'm really exhausted, I say, oh, I'm sick and tired of being an activist. Because it's like, you know, I mean, I'm going through something with a gallery in Brisbane at the moment, and, you know, I won't go into details, but it's like, they're not paying me an artist fee. It's like, I spent my life working, advocating, amplifying the need for artist agreements and artist fees, and it's like nothing happened. I remember, and I wish I could remember the artist, there was a woman artist who'd been making art since the 1970s, was in a fabulous show called Unfinished Business at ACA a few years ago now, and one artist was saying, you know, since, you know, 50 years later, I can't believe the project of feminism, we're still dealing with the same challenges and complications and concerns, and it's true, you know, the ongoing project of feminism, you know, as you know, it doesn't stop, and the same thing with the ongoing project of artist run activity, it doesn't stop. But when you're constantly complicating and troubling things, and I think the space that one of the spaces that artist run communities and activity occupies is an activist space. It's really important because they exist outside of formal institutional mainstream structures. And that's what makes them interesting. I mean, on the way here, I was in West End, and I was just sitting there having a cigarette, and I was looking at how weird and wonderful West End, and I was thinking, you know what, one of the things that I feel, and I'm finishing a doctorate at QUT, and I've been reflecting on so many things in my life, and I was just thinking, you know, what I really love about artist run initiatives, artist run spaces, you know, artist collectives, artist cooperatives, whatever the artist grouping is that in Queensland and in South East Queensland, particularly in Brisbane, we've managed to maintain this sort of continuity of strange, weird and unruly spaces. And it's very different to elsewhere. Architecture is part of it.
Do you, like, relate that to being under, like, Joe Bjorky-Peterson and stuff? Like, do you think that's, like, that punk, like, the punk scene sort of, like, continuing, or the punk culture and the DIY culture and all the things that flourish when when you're living in a police state,
Well, I guess
basically.
if you look at it, it depends what lens you use. I mean, I like to think about things in terms of living memory. And when my so-called generation dies out, whenever that is, which is starting to happen now, living memory changes. And so living memory is a really important part of the work that I do, because I haven't done an audit, but I can't tell you how many friends and colleagues I've lost in the last 13 years of making ARI Remix, and it will continue. And so that's part of the message that I'm trying to convey, is that, don't underestimate, when people are going to die and what stories are going to be lost, let alone what's sitting in that shoebox. Sort of really all I'm trying to say. But to answer your question, Marissa, I wonder, but when I was sitting in West End and looking at all the wonderful weirdness and people in the most amazing costumes and carrying incredible trolleys and hand painted this and hand painted that and all the rest of it, I was thinking that we hear, dominant narrative is not the right word, but part of me is like, yeah, I was a punk at high school. I was into punk and post-punk and new wave music. I was also into disco, and I was also into new wave, and I was also into electronica, and I was also into sound art. And that's they're just some of my popular cultural interests. But same with many other artists. And so we hear these narratives about punk and post-punk, certainly. And the whole DIY ethos emerged from all of that, and that's one of the things that I like emphasising with artist run communities, because doing it ourselves culture comes from DIY culture, that same participatory and DIY ethos. But I think, yes, in part, because living memory is still shaping and informing, because the reality is a lot of healing still needs to happen. I look at, I'll be honest, I look at institutions like State Library of Queensland, don't get me wrong, I love it. But when I see stuff about, the 1980s, it's like a sentence. And it's like, what?
Yeah.
And actually Museum of Brisbane did it too. That show, what was that show, the women's exhibition? It was wonderful.
100 years ago.
Yeah, what was the title of that exhibition?
Was it that? I might be getting it.
Yeah, it had a title. Anyway, again, the same thing, like in the 80s, there was like 2 sentences, and the same with the 70s. It's like, how, then I go into, if I was a young person today, I'd be asking more about those 1 or 2 sentences, which is what I was doing. So when I started, I was like, who are the Bar Giant groups in the 1940s? What was the Pink Elephant Cafe? And why was it full of drag queens, and why was Vivian Lee and Laurence Olivier going there when they were playing in theatre in Brisbane in the war period? Laurence Olivier was bisexual as was Vivian, I think. Anyway, the point I'm making is that when you're young, you're thirsty for knowledge, you want to know stuff, but you also want to know what the fit is for you, and is an ARI a good fit? And so we knew that it was a good fit because there was necessity, because there was nothing. And now there's all these different, I don't use the term models, I use the term examples. There's all these different examples of what an artist run initiative can be, how it can be, quite specific, or how it can be sort of really messy, or all of these things, how it can be, a feminist engagement approach, or queer engagement, or BIPOC engagement. It can be whatever you want it to be. There's no rules. You decide what the rules are as a group, and that is why they continue to exist. So the first question I ask is, so what are you up against?
Yeah.
And then people often don't know what to say, because they might, I won't mention their name, but someone said to me recently, but I don't think of myself as a political person. I said, then why are you running an artist run initiative?
Yeah.
And they were like, oh. So, but, that's just my lens, because I, with my colleagues and peers and many others around the world, evolved, when things were very different in the 1980s. Glasnost, all these things, the Berlin Wall, all of these things happened in the 1980s. So the cultural moment we're in right now, so back to you guys, to you folks rather, what, do people ask you how to start an ARI? I remember a conversation with you at Records.
You ask Amelia.
Yeah, we remember that conversation at Records in the winter.
I've lost the conversation to see about how to start ARI's Paul. That's one of our conversations that we have every time. And yeah, I get asked a lot.
And what do you say?
Just start one. just find something you like find a couple friends, get together and do a thing. Whether it's talking on a live stream or just sitting down and having a conversation. Whether you intentionally read something together or exhibiting or having a barbecue in the park once a Sunday, like every month or something. And then you get together and maybe someone activates it and does like a performance, and someone has like another performance, or there's like you're showing your flip books with other people, your sketchbooks, like there's so like that has potential to become a thing. And I mean, I know that person you spoke with, I don't know who you're talking about, but they're going, oh, I don't think of myself as a political person, because they haven't realized that starting an ARI and being in an ARI is actually kind of a revolutionary act, because we're basically saying we don't need the institutions because we can create our own perception of art and our own perception of, you know, creating community and conversations with one another, and through that we develop a parallel culture to the one institutions want us to have. And this is where I think that you're like actually amazing for, is because this documentation of all these things that have happened over time is how we can learn from the past. We can learn from, you know, some ARIs burn out and they fall apart. Oh, why'd that happen? Okay, we can examine that thing and we can improve. So that when people ask me to start ARIs, I'm like, just get together with some friends, you know, whether you agree with them, like, or whether you agree with them politically or you're just friends or whatever, like whatever your commonality is. Maybe it's just, hey, you want to start an ARI? Hey, I also want to start an ARI. Does this person want to start an ARI? Maybe if we all want to start an ARI together, we can start an ARI and achieve all of our dreams. Or our first goal of starting an ARI and doing something.
I think of doing ARI work as really like inherently optimistic. And just a few weeks ago, I was talking to a quite high profile like advocate consultant who is really working on that like top level with like boards of institutions and stuff and agitating for change there. And they were not feeling optimistic. Like that was I think they were pretty burnt out and feeling pretty cynical, at least when we talked. And I was so full of optimism just because I'm working with people like in the mud with me. And it's an optimistic activity, and like that joy of just like meeting a couple of other people, like especially because we're running a kind of political ARI, it's like just knowing like who's in your corner, because often it's like not said publicly and quietly people come up to you and you're slowly like building this network of like who's in your corner, who has like similar politics to you, who's also got shared struggle, like how many of us are burnt out, you know, like so yeah, like I don't know about any of you, but have you found that like your ARI activity can like feed what you're doing in the institutions energetically, or at least be a counterpoint to it? Yeah.
I like that it's an optimistic act. I think when we're running the laundry art space, like I don't think I've ever had as much energy as the years we were doing laundry. And I think it's like a contagious optimism that comes from community, because when your optimism dwindles or like your burnout sets in, if you've developed the community that you're running an ARI with, you know, you take turns lifting each other up and you have someone to bounce your ideas off of, and like you all encourage each other, not really to any ends, just to be encouraged, which is really nice. Yeah.
I agree, absolutely. I mean, you develop those effective bonds, those really strong effective bonds, because of the ebb and flow of all the emotions, you know, the highs, the lows and everything in between. When someone's having a really challenging time, you know, and maybe, and because I often think it's to do with expectation, you know, in your wonderful Beaver chat about burnout, there was a lot of talk about, you know, expectation around, you know, having an exhibition. And then right at the end, you know, and everyone sort of talked about those sorts of challenges, you know, having an exhibition and different viewpoints and perspectives. And at the end of your chat, you talked about process. And I think that, you know, if we start to think about ARIs as a process rather than as a space or a bunch of publications or, you know, a bunch of exhibitions and a program and those sorts of things, and see it as a process that's incredibly multimodal, then that helps. And so, you know, I was really heartened at the end of that talk. You'd gone through all of these machinations, all these ebbs and flows, the tumult of burnout and the different experiences and different contexts and different feelings of nuance that people felt. And then you talk about process. So I thought that was really revealing in that chat. Because process is, as you know, it's about a whole bunch of things simultaneously. And the process, so you might have one exhibition and you might expect that 30 people are going to come to the opening and maybe 3 people come to the opening. And I remember back in the day, you'd say, but it's quality, it's not quantity, it's quality, it's not quantity. And you say, but look who these 3 people are, you know, that sort of stuff. And that example that you just provided, knowing where, you know, when someone's down, you like say, yeah, but maybe look at it through this lens. Maybe look at it through that lens. And that...
Which is what you did to me.
Well, yeah, that's what but I've learned how to do that.
Yeah.
Because I've been, you go through so much stuff. And you know, the effective bonds that you develop because you do go through so much stuff together. And you learn how to synthesize things and how to assimilate things and how to transform things. And often through, you know, what you said, Amelia, like you just, you know, let's try this. Let's just start with that. Let's plunge in. I always say, just, you know, plunge in when someone asks me how to start an ARI. Just plunge in. Do what you want to do. There's no rules. I mean, one reason I started ARI Remix was because there's a whole bunch of starting points for it. But I just wanted to just demonstrate that, you know, young artists, or in fact, they don't have to be young artists of any age or background need to know that they're not reinventing the wheel.
No.
They're not reinventing the wheel. But where was the stuff to look at about knowing evidence-based approach about that? That's why, that was the key reason it started.
Yeah.
And the other key, and Ephemeral Traces, obviously, which is an exhibition 2016, which is a long process. But the other thing is, and I was telling this to my supervisors at QUT just recently, Peloton was a space, artist run space in Sydney, in Surrey Hills, I used to love going to for a number of years when I lived in the Blue Mountains. And anyway, I went to see a show there, I can't remember the show, a group show. And then I was talking to one of the young members, 2 young members, about how it's going, and they were burnt out.
Yeah.
In fact, they could barely speak, and they were like 22. And I was like, I know that feeling. And anyway, I won't sort of recapitulate what they were saying, but they were basically saying how you know, you're wearing all these different hats. All, you know, this hat goes up, you put this hat on, you put this hat, and you're wearing all these different hats, and that hasn't changed like that. But the internet is, and the demands of web-based stuff is just growing and growing and growing. Anyway, the reason I'm mentioning that story is I ended up doing an interview. I said to them, can I do because I was doing a lot of street press in those days, and I said, can I interview you for a story about Peloton, because what you're saying is like, I need to write this down. And they were, as it turned out, when I went back 3 weeks to Sydney, they had decided to sort of close down. It was like, oh, really interesting time, because it's not just how you start an ARI, it's what your exit strategy might be.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing for us to maybe talk about now.
Yeah.
But anyway, the reason I mention this is because I wanted to get to that thing about when you start an ARI, it's like, how do you finish an ARI? And in the before the interview, we were just sort of saying, these are the questions I'm going to ask. I said, by the way, do you know much about Queensland ARIs? And this is the conversation a few weeks earlier. And they both looked at me, they were students at Sydney College of Arts, and said, we know all about Queensland ARIs. And I was like, yes. And I said, what do you know? And they said to me, Q space annex. And I was like, in 1980, 81, 82. They said, yep, John Nixon. He's amazing. And then I was like, yes. I was thinking, and nothing else came out of them. And I was like...
What year was this conversation taking place?
This was 2012.
Oh, so their memory of
how many years
ARIs
later?
was
30
in
years
the
later.
80s, yeah.
And so, you know, they're learning from their educators in Sydney College of the Arts about Queensland ARIs, and what they know about is John Nixon. And they spent the rest of the time talking about John Nixon, who was a very famous Australian artist, modernist artist, and I would suggest, who died a few years ago. But it was the director of the IMA here in Brisbane at some point. And when they said that, I was sort of really astonished. And because they were clearly, they were working and they were involved in other ARIs, like First Draft and stuff in Sydney. So I was just like, and then I caught the train back to the Blue Mountains. I was like, need to do something about this. This is not okay. So there's an example of something that I felt, I as an artist that has been an ongoing member of ARIs, keeping in mind, I started another ARI in 2015, a couple of years later, and that experience was like, I can't believe that people to this day, particularly young people, don't know about Queensland Artist Run Initiatives. There are thousands of them. I mean, I joke with friends like we're just touching on the tip of the iceberg, which is all you can do. But anyway, so how to start an ARI, long-winded way of getting to, well, how do you finish an ARI? So So when you all were involved in starting ARIs, did you start to talk about this optimism that you were referring to? Does the optimism eclipse the idea that one day we're going to say, toodle poops?
I've never thought about
I've never
that.
done it. I've never thought about how it's going to finish at the beginning.
Wait, this thing
I've
finishes?
had to find exit strategies. Some of them very imperfect.
I think the ARIs that do think about exit strategies tend to take a professionalized approach. Like they'll start off quite informal. I'm thinking of Outer Space as an example that started off in a warehouse space because the two directors had finished their the making part of their PhD, but they still had the studio. So in the year of writing their thesis, they were like, what are we going to do with the studio space? We'll turn it into an artist run initiative and host shows. And then wanting there to be an exit strategy for those directors, they ended up with a board. When they lost their initial space, they applied for a subsidised space with Brisbane City Council, and from the professionalisation of that space, they then got the bell tower, and now you're on the board.
And it's an organisation now.
Yeah. And those directors are no longer involved in outer space, but it's an ARI that lives on. But I also think that some ARIs make the mistake of seeing that model, or you call them examples, and thinking they need to incorporate straight off the bat that is the plan for an ARI. And I actually think it's the byproduct of what you want to do with it after the optimism and the initial kick stage has already happened. So sitting in the optimism of just wanting to do things and complicate things and make trouble is totally fine. You don't need to be planning your exit strategy when you start your ARI.
You don't think you do have to do that?
Yeah, I reckon it can come later. If you do want it to live on. I think with our my first ARI, we didn't have an exit strategy. We'd never thought about it. And then as a result, it's not still going. But it was very much the artists who run it were the ARI, and so there wasn't an ARI after those artists moved on. So I guess depends on what your goal is, because if your goal as a practicing artist is to make ARI activity part of your practice, then it makes sense that there is an exit strategy that you just might move on to another project as you do in practice.
There's an article, online article, I can't think of the name of it at the moment, that I often send to people. I gave a talk at the Harvey Bay Regional Gallery last year, which was, to really sort of catalyse different artists in the region. And we're talking hundreds and hundreds of kilometres who came to this thing at the Harvey Bay Regional Gallery. And it was called Better Together Artist Collectives. And so they asked me to come along and talk about exactly what we're talking about today. And I remember it was well, how do you... So I talked about the same sorts of things. And then, interestingly, at the end, people ask questions that we're dealing with now. And some people hadn't thought that an ARI was something they could start because they thought it was something other people did.
Yeah.
I know. It's and I say the same thing about archives. Anyone can start an archival project. And you decide, today, archives are so different to what they used to be. And it's the same with an ARI. Why wouldn't you start an ARI? Why wouldn't you just plunge in and start And this article that is, I put at the bottom of that post, I did a series of examples of, because I focused a lot on regional spaces that we've covered over the years. And the article says something at the end. It's a lovely little story. And it's a US thing, but it's really global in its feel and its thinking. And it said something like, ARIs are sort of like sailing off into the ocean with the sail half made. And I just thought it was a really lovely poetic, idea that you don't have to have the sail fully made to be able to set your boat off into the ocean.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really lovely metaphor.
Yeah. What I related to when you were speaking, Noam, was like the pressure to professionalize, which I actually really think has it's increased a lot, I think. In the last even 5 years, but probably over a few decades, because you do get people saying, oh yeah, I want to start an ARI, so I'm gonna incorporate as an association. It's maybe it's part of just how we're just increasingly institutionalized. I think we're just educated in an increasingly institutionalized mindset, but also risk aversion, things are so much more precarious that maybe you want to have some less risk around it, you want to have the insurance, you want to have all of that going, and maybe also just that internalized careerism that you're also kind of educated into. It's kind of interesting, I feel you can feel when an ARI is just there for artist activity and support of artist activity versus when the people who started the ARI are this is going to launch me to my next thing. I think you can kind of tell from the energy. I don't know what you all think, but that's
I think
the thing that I see.
The pressure to professionalize is what the laundry art space was trying to trouble.
Yes.
Because this is at least my experience, and why I wanted to be involved in it was exhibiting was so expensive, and materials for artwork was so expensive, and even just hanging things on the wall and and patching paint and stuff. I wanted there to be transparency of how much it costs to put on a show, and if you chose to not put your own savings up for an exhibition to rent a space to patch the walls to make it look all professional, what's a bare bones exhibition look like when you're upfront with people about the fact that you don't have the money to be professional. And so you can engage in any aesthetic to answer the problem of anything that's blocking you from starting an ARI. You can make that part of your model, an example, and your way of troubling things. If you feel you can't start an ARI because you don't have this in your favor, or you don't have these resources, make that part of your mode of working. If you don't have a space, engage with the fact that you don't have a space and be transparent about the limits to not having a space to exhibit in, and these are other ways of working because space is limited. And then you can use your ARI to platform that problem.
So when you say sort of trouble this idea of professionalism, what do you feel if you sort of unpack that a bit more, Noam? So you've talked about some of the things, but do you feel what you were specifically troubling was this sort of institutional definition of what an arts professional might be, as opposed, because I feel that what is professional in an artist run community is very different to what might be professional at the Queensland Art Gallery or the Institute of Modern Art. And I think that's sort of what you were just sort of teasing out there, was that idea that you can incorporate, so whatever that example is that you're employing for your activity, in an ideal space you might do all these things, if you had funding and you had a website and you had IT group who could do this, that and the other, but the reality is you don't. And so you adapt and you're resourceful and you go, well, the necessity, actually at the end of the day, if I'm really honest, this is what's necessary for us to do this. And so, I wanted to pick up on what Marisa was saying about, and maybe not right now because Marisa's just left the room, but I think the other thing is that, what's that? It's not my, bottle of...
No, it's
No.
his emotional support fruit cup that he likes to choose.
Emotional support fruit cup.
Oh, we all need an emotional support.
But probably not right near the Zoom mic where you just hear it crackling.
So the I'm going to hold off until Marisa comes back. I'll just hold that thought. But so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that so what do we mean by professional?
Yeah.
And professionalising and professionalism. So we're just sort of touching on this thing about so when we talk, what are we talking about when we talk about professionalising and professionalism?
Really
I'm really interested in what your perspectives are, because I think the thing is, going back to your question about and your interest in Art Workers, Queensland Art Workers Alliance, and previously the Art Workers Union of Queensland, there was a shift that was occurring. Art Workers Union was a nationalised, it was a nationalising approach, so there were unions in all states and territories, I think in all territories, maybe, I think. And then there was a real shift in Queensland, in southeast Queensland in particular, where there was a talk about, a trade union, whilst there are lots of good, speaking about good, bad and the ugly, with our talk today, there are lots of really good things about trade unions, and there's lots of really good things about what the Art Workers Union has been doing. I think it started in 1978, maybe it's 1976, certainly around that time frame, tied into the union movement, long history in Australia that's, that I don't fully understand. My dad was a builder, he was a part of the CFMEU, and his grandfather was part of unions and all that sort of stuff, so I know bits of it. But the point was that at the time, we were interested in professionalising artist run initiatives in 1986. So there were meetings over 1984, 85, 86, public meetings in 1986 to shift, what did we do? Did we unincorporate? I can't actually remember what we did now. Anyway, the Art Workers Union dissolved, and then the Queensland Art Workers Alliance, there had to be a public meeting and all sorts of things. And Brian Doherty was really the champion of all of that, an advocate for all of that, and many of us were part of that shared emphasis in we need to professionalise. But there was a very clear sort of mandate that what we were professionalising was around the way that unions are understood, and that what we were trying to say was, we do projects with the teachers union, we do have artists who are doing mural making, we do have artists that are doing protest marches and organising floats and things, because every May Day, every Labour Day there were marches, all protest marches, union marches, it was all on the streets, very different to now. In terms of local activity, the protests now are generally around global issues, which is fantastic. But the point I'm trying to make is that, so we wanted to professionalise around this idea that artists, artists do make things, and we've learnt trades. Some people know how to do pottery, and some people know how to make kilns and all the rest of it. But we're like musicians, and we're like architects, and we're like writers and authors, and so we have a professional status that's was not encapsulated, encompassed by union activity. And so that shift was to sort of say, as visual artists, we are art workers. Here we are again saying the same thing 40 years later, which just, again, another example of what is going, and all the same issues. Artist agreements, equal pay for people regardless of their gender, and their binary or non-binary status. We didn't look at. We looked at a national living wage, the idea of a living wage for artists, which is something that I'm really glad that you're picking up on in your work. A little bit differently, but again, this idea that we do work, and we're constantly being asked by institutions to do work. I can't believe that we're not getting paid to do this work. And unless you trouble and complicate it, you don't get your point across. But if you don't trouble and complicate it, then you get the job. And sometimes if you trouble and complicate it, you don't get the job.
Yeah.
And it pisses me off.
I suppose when I was talking about troubling professionalism, I was talking about professionalism perceived purely from an output perspective. So if you're looking at the exhibition model, what constitute a professional artist, and that's actually skipping a lot of steps in understanding of professionalism, which I think you just filled in, having a perfect white box exhibition that is well presented, and it's like a social indicator that all the other needs were met that you spoke about, like being paid fairly for your work, like having the space supported so that it's not your personal finances going into the space, all of those sorts of things, like workers' rights for artists. I noticed at the time that we were doing our ARI that whether or not those material needs had been met for the artists running artist run initiatives, they'd skip to the end step of doing a professional exhibition to give the perception that they had professionalized and were successful, even though material needs weren't being met. And so I think I wanted a transparency of the fact that material needs are not being met by putting on makeshift shows.
Putting a show in your laundry.
But what a great place to put on a show.
Yeah. It's great.
Yeah.
You know, how much time do we spend in the laundry? How much time does everyone spend in the laundry?
Yeah.
But I think, like people thinking of starting an ARI who are focused on those like professional milestones of like, I'll start an ARI because it means I might get a job as an arts worker. They're kind of feeding into a system that focuses on the outputs. Like if there's exhibitions going on, we've got a healthy arts ecology. So if ARIs are putting out exhibitions, then everything's fine. Artists are happy because they're working, and like happy artists make work, and it doesn't matter if they're compensated for that work. And so
and developers are happy because there's more cultural activity happening in the city that they can then brand and profit off. And, you know,
then
everyone's happy except the artists.
And then they all have to. This is the thing about getting older, is I've seen this happen time and time again, where this gentrification, and then the reason why the development happens. And I'm not anti-development. I'm anti-ethical, non-ethical, unethical, and non-consultative development. It's you know, I mean, look what's happening to West End and Highgate Hill. I can't believe the high-rise. You know, I was sitting there in what street was it? Just off the main street in West End, and thinking, thank goodness that, you know, at least this section is like it's been for a really long time. And there's multicultural restaurants and people, you know, there's a Colombian restaurant over there, there's an African cafe there, you know. That's the way it's sort of been since the 1950s, and thank heavens. And yet, I could see, and I started counting them, thinking, oh, not interested. I'd rather have my iced coffee. Thank you very much. But the point is that you know that the development stuff is an important part of the conversation, because. You know, and there's lots of stuff in the literature about gentrification, and actually in my literature there is a example of the way that artists just organise around that. So it's you can smell all the island smells. I think that little doggy.
He likes shoelaces.
Does he?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's what you're trying to get at. Where else are I going with that? So. So development, and right here where we are now, in inner city Brisbane, it's happening so quickly. In fact, I remember about 4 or 5 years ago when I came back to Brisbane, it's like, oh my God, look at all those cranes and those the scaffolding and stuff. It's exactly what it was like in 1986, 87. The same horizon line.
A lot more ARIs and artists are working with developers. Maybe out of necessity, but also...
Yeah, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how I feel about it.
Well, a good thing in that there's conversation. Do you feel like there's conversation and dialogue happening? Or not? Is it sort of...
I think there should be more.
So developers are imposing a perspective on others, on artists?
No, but I think I think the thing that troubles me about it is that artists are sort of brought into a development that is often a really high-end development, an unaffordable one, that is actively pushing artists, immigrants and other people out of the suburb. So the artists are kind of like, it's great for an artist to have space and opportunities and things like that, but then are they kind of contributing to a broader thing that's not very good, and it's going to be great. Like, I'm just going to say, like, the Labour Party right now is like yeah, we really want a lot of arts and culture, which is great, and I love more arts and culture in the city, but unless you have that like framing around like how is that just going to like create more gentrification, and is that just going to make rents higher, and most artists are renters, you know, are you actually just kind of like, are you helping anyone who's below middle class, really? Like that would be my question.
I feel like we're now talking about the bad and ugly.
Yeah, we're in the bad and ugly of ARIs.
Was the good optimistic enough?
The optimism's gone.
Yeah. We did cover optimism, so the good.
Yeah,
okay, so what's
vibes.
after optimism?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these developments I also think of as like being a continuation of the colonial process too. Like,
Well, and look, and you know,
I really don't like unsustainable development.
It's true. I remember QUT. I was sitting. I was getting some counselling at QUT, and in the psychology section, I was reading this fabulous oral history done by Helen Cleby, and it was looking at QUT and Brisbane like pre-settlement, and there were stories, First Nation stories there, and I remember some of the really old photos thinking, oh my God, that's what Brisbane, that's what Meanjin looked like. That's what the creeks looked like. That's what the gullies looked like. That's what Creek Street looked like.
Yeah.
And so we're operating as ARIs, we're, you know, effectively, unless we're First Nations or, Indigenous, we're operating on, in terms of ethical considerations, we're operating on stolen land. And so these are other things that are part of, you know, so what's really great about ARIs is they're constantly supporting marginalised, oppressed, minoritized people. That is a constant. That is a continuum of support. That hasn't changed. In fact, it's only grown. However, you know, moving forward, and you know, in light of the no last year, you know, how do ARIs engage with, you know, I guess, you know, the challenges of operating on unceded land is one thing.
August.
And development is a part of that, because you know, what are the ethical considerations of development? I don't know. Where do you find that? Where do you find that information?
Is there any?
Is there?
Considerations?
Can someone start an ARI about development? It'd be really interesting.
So, just to clarify the good and the bad. Sorry, the bad and the ugly, Marisa. What were your qualifiers and your descriptors with bad and ugly? Because I've actually forgotten.
Bad was like institutional and political and economical limitations to artist-run activity and an artist-led sector. Because you're a huge champion of artist-led sector, which I think we touched on a little of like how artist-led is our institutions and museums and yeah.
They're not.
No, but look, that's why. Look what you're doing. Look what you're doing. You know, the iterative, this sort of recurring factor is really important to advocate and to amplify. You've all got that already, all three of you, and that's really important. And in fact, when you start to talk to more people, you just realise how much people have done, and that knowledge, that generativity of knowledge. And knowledge production is untapped often. You know, that's another reason why I do what I do, because you're just constantly unfolding things. You know, literally like you're going through a shoebox. Look at those postcards. Oh my God, that was made in 1994. Crikey, that sort of stuff. And so back to the bad and the ugly. What do we want to talk about? Development, obviously.
Yeah.
I was keen to ask you about like interpersonal politics of the ARI and when they go wrong.
Oh yeah, that was the ugly face.
Was that the ugly? Okay,
yeah.
good.
Well, ugly, and you said, what was the wording? But can be kind of cute. There was a little message about ugly can be kind of cute. It's funny because, can I be really honest? I when I read that, I was like, oh my God. But like, I often, friends and I often joke about, I'm going to do a XXX rated version of ARI Remix one day. When I get really old and I start to, become a heroin addict, I'm just going to really go nuts and tell all the untold stories. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to.
doing
hold
this.
so much gossip.
Well,
Like,
Ari
but-
remix
so much
uncensored.
But
uncensored.
it's actually and so yeah, that's why I use that metaphor about the tip of the iceberg, because interesting thing is that, you know, I've experienced and witnessed a whole lot of stuff over a long period of time, but I'm also talking constantly, time and time again, and dialogically with people about stuff, and then you might mention something that's happened, and then, whoa. So one example that I won't mention who, but I'll mention what happened. It was at Queensland College of Art, which is now on in South Bank, as many of you know. So originally it was originally it was at QUT Garden Spot campus, and then it was QCA Seven Hills Morningside, and I can't remember, that was maybe 70s. That I should know this, but I think it was 70s. Anyway, ended up at Morningside, brutalist architecture, all that sort of stuff, and was there for many years before it relocated. And one of the reasons it was out there was like, you know, this idea of Joe making sure that none of the students could sort of cross-pollinate. None of the artists could cross-pollinate. Put that mob out there at Morningside, and that mob out there at St Lucia, and that mob there at Kelvin Grove, and there was that mob there. You know, then they're too far apart. You know, buses were fucked. There were very few ferries. But anyway, the story I'm sorry, I digress. The story I'm telling is this opening for the demolition show documentation. It was a documentation show of the demolition show, which was held at the Observatory Gallery in Little Roma Street, which no longer exists. The Little Roma Street, it was demolished. Anyway, so everyone goes to this documentation show of what happens when an Artist Run Initiative gets demolished. And in fact, a whole series of streets get demolished. It was incredible. And but it's funny how you remember things. I remember this one person who walked up to another person who'd had a couple of glasses, like big glasses of fluted glasses of champagne, and they had then proceeded to. Because I could see all of this. They were like all this was happening right in front of me, like a big, you know, a cinema screen. And this person had gone to fill up the glass, and they walked up ceremoniously to this other person, held the glass up. It's all done in slow motion and then poured the glass of champagne over someone's head. And I was having chats with two people beside me, and I was like, look at this. And then, but what I remember, like, it was just like, you know, that was the first time I'd seen something like that happen. So I was like, you know, okay. Anyway, but what struck me was the person who had the champagne poured on them, just stood there and smiled. And I was like, fucking great. And that person was someone that I collaborated a lot with. And it really helped me understand grace and compassion. So, you know, for me, whilst that was, and it was actually quite ugly, and I'm going with the interpersonal, and so that had happened because basically someone was sleeping with someone's previous partner. But when I read your thing about good, the bad, and the ugly, I was like, okay, let's go with this because that's what you ought to do. I thought I'm not going to trouble and complicate it because I actually really like it. But that's what I first thought of, actually. But then when I thought more about it, I thought what I remembered was that when my colleague had been non-reactive and non-violent and were absolutely in their agency, in the right. Like if you want to get really ethical, like what they had done nothing wrong in terms of an interpersonal relationship. And then I started to think about, but what about the interpersonal relationships where there are red flags? And the thing is I think what's important to talk about is that what happens in any group situation, artist grouping, you know, as well as, you know, a grouping in an institution or in an educational body or whatever, the same sort of stuff happens. This is not exclusive to ARIs. But I think the difference is, you know, like, you know, a university's got there's infrastructure around mental health, well-being, etiquette, you know, counselling, support, safe spaces. ARIs have to do, so, you know, how do you do all of that? So if there's red flags that come up and it's actually something that maybe it was something that was tacit and not known, and then suddenly it's like, oh my God, that's been going on for 6 months. That's not okay. Then how do ARIs, along with every single thing, every single cat, every single element of their beingness and their existence, how do they then learn how to accommodate those things? So, when we talk about how do you begin an ARI, plunge in, just start, but some mindfulness around just knowing that, like any group setting, any group structure, there are interpersonal challenges. And often they don't reveal themselves straight away.
Yeah.
Are you saying that ARIs need a HR department?
No, because generally, and so that's a great question.
I make the
because
joke because we're the HR department. We've got a social worker that'll help out.
Okay, so imagine everyone that's been involved in an ARI makes a list of so basically they make 2 lists. There's a list of all the jobs they've done external from their ARI work, everything you've done, like I used to deliver posters, I used to deliver newsletters, all the things you've done, and then all the caps you wear inside an ARI. And each person does those 2 things, and you put them together like a diptych, and then they coexist, and you get 30 people to do that. And my God, well, what stories will that tell? Just by two lists and a confluence of those lists from, say, 30 artists. So that, the point I'm trying to make is that, you don't know what you're dealing with often in an ARI until you're dealing with it. Yeah, we expect that we're going to have a Facebook page, we're going to have an Instagram account. We might do a podcast from time to time. We might do a series like you guys are doing, Viva Chats. No, we don't need a website. Yeah, we could have Squarespace, but do we really need it? No, just have Insta. And you have these sort of discussions, and you work out what's necessary for you, what the necessities are for you, the needs and the values. But if someone says, no, we need a website, and 3 other people say, do we? Can we afford it? Yeah, it's $60 a week, but who's going to pay for that? Those sorts of questions. And so the point is about interpersonal relationships is often they in any group setting, in any situation, social situation, they might be sort of secret and clandestine and unknown and tacit, and then something happens and it's like, oh, there it is. And then what do you do? And so, but what I'm trying to say is that ARIs are generally involve people with diverse and incredible skill sets, who are highly resourceful, who are often very good communicators, not always, but often very good communicators. Some people, but that's important because other people might be not such a great communicator, but need to learn in an ARI setting, like in any group setting. Someone who might be really shy in a wallflower, next thing you know, they're doing performance art and it's all about their vagina or something. That stuff happens. And so, but when it comes to managing and coping and strategizing and caring and developing a system of care, I guess I see it as more broadly, like when I look at the NAVA website, and there was a bit of stuff once upon a time. There's like, what's the go-to place for information about, so there's a bit of stuff about governance on NAVA.
Therapy talk.
Well, all the stuff that this is why you're...
Therapy talk is where you learn how to deal with interpersonal
Where? Sorry?
problems.
Oh, TikTok.
TikTok.
TikTok, but the therapy stream.
And what? Oh, I think TikTok
Basically,
might be
I'm
another.
saying I don't think there is anything in the art.
So,
I
but that's
mixed up all day.
well, but also, but look at this conversation. I mean, if for people that are tuning in, I don't know if any of this is resonating with any of you, but it's like that's what's I think is intrinsically valuable about what you're doing, and this is just one element of what you're doing, is it providing a space, a safe space. We've got a little doggy with us to talk about stuff that often goes unspoken, and that some people might feel is taboo. For some reason.
It's the thing, because one thing that we've heard a lot is that when there is a really destructive dynamic happening, people don't know where to go or don't want to tell people because the scene is so small. They often don't want to tell the wrong person and have relationships get ruined or professional opportunities taken away. which is very hard. And so one of my questions is, how do we build an arts community more broadly that is safe and that's really caring and can actually deal with this stuff really maturely, especially if something quite serious has gone down. How do we make sure that the social community infrastructure is around, that people stay safe, and that people who are victims of stuff don't just end up having to leave, because that's unfortunately what happens most of the time, is that the person who has experienced this has to silently kind of exit the picture and sometimes exit the industry. So what does that look like? How do we start, making sure? I think one of the reasons that Beaver started, just to finish off, is that we wanted to be we're a safe place, a confidential safe place, because that was one of the needs that we identified right from the get-go.
And I think and I'm mindful of all those things that you're doing, but increased coordination, I keep mentioning that term, because increased coordination with, say, a clinic or counselling clinic or a counselling agency that's community-based, that is non-judgmental, that's objective and it's caring, developing those, partnerships isn't probably the right word, but developing those relationships, they're an example of the types of things that you can do. But that's a lot of work, because negotiating and partnering with someone around these things who has that professional expertise. But I mention that because I was one of the great things about doing a doctorate at QUT is I was able, as a student, to participate in very inexpensive and very affordable professional counselling over 3 months, which I couldn't afford in a commercial corporate scenario, and that was life changing for me, what I went through, because I dealt with 20 years of stuff in 3 months, which was not what I expected to happen, but I did, and it was wonderful.
Was it something
Pardon?
you considered with the Arts Workers Alliance? I know you guys had your work cut out for you, just getting artist agreements in place. And
we were all very sharing, caring and feeling people, mainly, and very similar to exactly what you're doing.
But in terms of partnering with a mental health organization.
And so that
seems like something a union, if we had a union, would someone make
but this is that's another key differentiation. So we we were lucky. I worked on co-founded a space called That Space, or That Contemporary Art Space. We had an artist there who was an arts therapist. An older person. And when I say older, 10 years older, so they're in their 30s. Then, but you know how age is so relative when you're young, and that hasn't changed. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that so they were terrific, and so they would have one-on-one conversations with people, and they had that objectivity, they had that professional expertise. That's just one example of many people that did that. And there were other people. We were very intergenerational. There were people involved in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. We were non-elite, non-dominant, totally inclusive, non-ageist, all of those things. And this is why I do, because people have this idea that we're all ratbags. Well, there was an element of ratbaggery, and there's an element of being roughshod, but we wanted to professionalise things, but what we were trying to say is, but professionalise things on our terms and in our way and in our time. And they were based on particular conditions of prior conditions of existence and current conditions of existence, and what the better and more fair and more just future was going to be for us then. So but that's not unlike exactly what you're doing, the way I see it. I would suggest another form of increased coordination is, a union, great idea in terms of this is the good, the bad and the ugly thing, but what about a more facilitatory role based on and building on exactly what you're doing now? So you can augment Beaver through other types of relationships, other types of groupings, other types of organisational settings that deal with effective stuff. So that frees you up to then make art that you want to make. I want to make this public artwork about this. I want to say F you to such and such. This is what I want to do. As well as run your ARI and do other things, do more education if you want to. But you augment what you're doing and so that is something that we were doing then. And we would use things like satellite space. We used to call them satellite spaces because we wanted to, like we had a satellite space in the valley, for example, because we unlike now, where there is no space that's affordable, we had so much space that was sort of affordable, or you could make it affordable. Fortunately, I knew how to, somehow, I don't know how, I managed to talk people down from saying, yeah, but we can, because, you know, I would say we can breathe life into this place full of pigeon shit, is basically what I would say. And they knew, and we knew that they knew that they were on a good wicket for us to, because we would clean all the pigeon shit. We would get all the excreta and all the paper mache spit bombs off the windows, and we'd get the cobwebs down, and you know what I'm saying. Whereas now it's like, well, what space? You know, so good in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly. I remember going to the BARI festival, 2 panel discussions, and I asked people at that panel discussion, I was in the crowd, you know, do you need a physical space? And every person, there were 3 people that said, no, we just need virtual space. And all of those 3 people ended up having physical spaces for Artist Run Initiatives. So, you know, I was actually a bit astonished that they were saying, no, we just need virtual spaces, because it makes sense. I mean, that's why I do ARI Remix, because, you know, it's an internet artwork. You don't need a white cube. But interestingly, people articulating that then actually had physical spaces. I won't mention who they were, but just an example of how a perception, not start an ARI because we just have a website, and the website can function as a gallery. You just call it gallery, or whatever you want to, or project space, or publication, whatever you want to call it, because that's how the internet started, and that hasn't gone away. What's changed is we've got this incredible deluge of multinational global entities run by a bunch of rich white guys. So that's another ugly, I think that's an ugly thing. But I call it a Faustian pact, pact with the devil that we make. Imagine if all the artists suddenly said goodbye to Facebook and Instagram, what a different space it would be.
I would love that.
Well, and where would they go? Maybe that's something Beaver could do.
TikTok.
Oh, really?
No, I'm kidding.
Art talk, yeah.
We're working on building servers so that we can host a website off of.
Yes. I've bought a Raspberry Pi computer so that we can self-host and get off our current Wix.com website.
Well, in terms of the
From,
future...
Like, evil, yeah.
So this
I
is
like
future
the idea
thinking.
of being like digitally independent.
Yeah,
in that way.
yeah, and that's already happening. There's lots of hackers and people and hacktivists involved in this sort of stuff, which has been going on since Web 1 as well. But I think we're going to see a return to that because, I mean, without mentioning, names within those major multinationals.
Oh, you can name evil billionaires.
I think many of us know who the evil billionaires are.
What are we streaming on?
But
YouTube?
when look what's going on in Australia with the federal government talking about, saying to Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, with Facebook saying, we don't agree to, licensing. We don't need news and what was the other thing? News and politics.
Yeah.
We don't need news and politics. I mean, isn't that what... for artists, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for many other communities.
Yeah.
And so when they say a blanket thing like that, you're like, what is the future of Facebook? I mean, counter-archiving... I mean, one thing I've started to do, which I haven't done very much because I don't have the time, is I've started to counter-archive the Facebook group for ARI Remix because it is rich with conversation and dialogue. I just don't have the time to do that, as in screenshots. That's but when I was looking the other day at Google Scholar, the amount of articles here's one for you, Amelia. The amount of articles that are coming up about counter-archiving Facebook and Instagram, TikTok, that will come in time. I mean, people now who are 14, 15, 16 on TikTok, in 10 years' time, imagine how much they've done on TikTok, and then what happens when that goes bust?
Yeah.
Or they pull it out, or they say, you're too old, or whatever they say. God knows what will happen. And so that's what's happening with Facebook, is there are groups that are saying, we've got to save this stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, there's the thing that kind of annoys me is there's still some MySpace pages with ARI activity from the mid 2000s. Courtney Coombs was involved in one.
Yeah.
And, you know, to
And
find that and to you can find some pictures are still there.
Yeah.
Some video and some audios are still there.
Yeah.
But the rest of it's just not there anymore.
Yeah.
Like, how great would it be to have had a full archive of this project?
Yeah, exactly. Or even well, you know, there's talk about, you know, what's called impartial or incomplete narratives. But the point that I'm trying to make is that, you know, for artist run communities that are already ephemeral and largely ephemeral,
Yes.
impartial, incomplete narratives are just part of the deal.
Yeah.
You know, I see ephemerality as an opportunity, not as a threat. You know, and I think going back to the broader topic of good, bad, and the ugly, I think that it's really great to advocate the optimism, because that is very much a part of an ARI at the beginning and the middle and the end. Because often what happens at the end is people are like, yes, but we can just start another ARI, but what we're going to do this, but we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
You know, and actually, I say we're not going to do that, but if we're not going to do that, we might do it differently.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things. So, you know, I think, so when we talk about the bad and the ugly, this is all about gathering knowledge and insight and allowing ourselves to reflect. I think, you know, what I got from looking at your burnout video podcast was this thing where we're in this attention economy where we're made by so many companies and multinationals to be busy all of the time that we don't have time to pause and reflect. We've got to have 5 jobs to pay the rent, let alone a mortgage. And now you pay the rent, but you don't know it's going to increase 13% in the next 12 months. You know, so, you know, there's these sorts of things that come up, and then you have these conversations and you come up with a solution, you have a different perspective and you have another perspective, and then you synthesize all of these things, and then something else happens over here. You know, that sort of stuff, and that's what ARIs do all the time.
Yeah.
And what, you know, you've been doing for a really long time. And that relationships. One thing that I feel is a missed opportunity with the Artworkers Alliance was social housing. I mean, I've been talking about it for 40 years. I talk about it with architects in a really informal way, because it's like, you know, I don't have that expertise. Social housing for artists is something I've been talking about for 40 years. I have conversations with architects. Every time I meet an architect, that's what I have a conversation about.
Could you imagine a social housing block of artists with a gallery at the bottom?
Yes, this is like one fantasy of mine, is that, okay, we have an ARI, it's incorporated not as a non-profit structure but a cooperative structure, because you can actually, this is what we haven't talked about actually today, is that you can like legally become a legal entity in a cooperative structure. Like, the non-profit isn't the only, it's not the only structure. And I often think, why aren't ARIs in a cooperative legal structure? Like, to me it makes way more sense, but anyway, it's a digression. But yes, fantasy of like, there's a high-rise building and somehow it's owned by artists. I don't know how this happened, but it happened. And the cooperative owns it, and it's like, yeah, it has a gallery in it somewhere. It also provides like some housing for the artists in that cooperative, office space, co-working space for them, studios, and then even maybe like a childcare facility or something like that. Basically it's like, it's all in one, and the artists, like, the ARI is providing everything you need to live. I just think that would be amazing. And maybe you have a little radical bookshop in there or something. I don't know. You got and a counselling space.
Well,
community meeting room. I don't know. But like, what's in your high rise? Everyone would have a different high rise.
I agree.
It'd be incredible.
So, okay, here's a solutions-based approach. So the other thing I talk about is this thing about reuptake and reinterpretation. And so one of the fabulous things about the Queensland Artworkers Alliance, which started in 1986, and it sort of dissolved in 2011 from memory. Actually, Nelly, you might remember the date better than me. Anyway, it was 2011, 2012. But so that's how many years is that? A long time. A lot of stuff happened, and that emerged out of the artist run scene. As did Eyeline, which is now, we don't know where. So there are two examples of things which came out of increased coordination
Yeah.
and coalitional activity. What I'm now going to, just based on everything you've just said, it takes me back to this thing called ABI. And ABI was arts built in, art built in. I think it was, and
I
it
thought
became
artist basic income.
Yeah.
Well,
or acquired
that's-
brain
yes.
injury, as we
Well,
realised
yes.
also stands for.
Yes, that's right. But it's done as A hyphen BI
Yeah.
is how it's abbreviated.
Yeah.
Artists built in.
Yep. Arts or art, no, now I can't remember if it's art or art. I think it was art built in. However, the focus, and this is entirely Queensland based and entirely Queensland Art Workers Alliance based, responding to exactly what you just said. However, the lens for art built in was to get 3 to 5% from every new building developed for public artwork. Now, so I this is another conversation I have with people. Imagine if that example or model of a Queensland Art Workers Alliance initiative was transformed and reshaped and re-informed by what's going on now in relation to artist social housing. I mean, why couldn't you have artist social housing in a high-rise? Of course you can. Why wouldn't you have a gallery space and a round table space and God knows whatever else? And a kitchen, a shared kitchen, as a part of this concept of art built in. So art built in might actually today, just as a provocation, might actually be art, ARIs, archives and action built in. I don't know, whatever. It could, that's determined by people who are organising socially and culturally in this particular cultural moment. Now, there's two things that are going on, not just this feeling that you're talking about, this groundswell of what if, this has already happened, this stuff, in relation to public art. That went on for a very long time. In fact, it devolved because a bunch of artists said, no, we don't want that. And there's a long story behind that, but there's quite a bit in the literature about that stuff that's worth reading.
It happened for a minute, didn't it? That 5% of every
Happened for a really long time.
Yeah.
I can't tell you the actual
every
time frame.
development.
Yes. So
has to
imagine
be
every new
public
building.
art. Yeah.
Now I mention that because just to build on what you're just saying and about this idea of this concept of increased coordination, but also, and all these buildings that have been built, my God, how many are happening here at the moment? I mean, goodness knows, just in this, couple of Ks, but also the Olympics. Now, God, what year are the Olympics? Brisbane Olympics.
2032.
Now, look, we are in unprecedented times, to use that expression. This hasn't happened before here. And the lead up to the Olympics, in fact, all funding policy for arts is somehow related to arts tourism in the lead up to the and you touched on this in some of your arts policy stuff, in the lead up to the Olympics in Queensland, that is. So for artists, the time is really ripe to action these things. So do you want to see, I'm thinking of your zine, do you want to see millions of dollars spent on coloured lights on the Story Bridge? Or would you rather see millions of dollars go into building structures that support, care for, nurture artists? And there might actually be a counselling clinic there as well that's community run. I mean,
Because it's a continuously generative model as well, like what you're talking about. Lights on the Story Bridge is just lights on the Story Bridge, but if you provide artists with their material basic needs, they will continuously make art and enrich that community, and the number of projects that will result from it will far surpass lights on a bridge.
So this is an example of relationship building with developers, for example, and with government, local, state, and federal too, because this could be a broader model. This is all we've got. The data's it's already been done. The thinking around it, the reuptake and reinterpretation, is what I'm suggesting. It's like yes, Magritte used to do this, and Schwitters used to make these sort of collages, and but what if we then apply that thinking to what you could do in a space? and so I'm just mentioning that as a provocation because I'm talking to architecture students on Wednesday about this sort of stuff, and I'm going to say the same types of things. I mean, yeah, but you know, I mean, a lot of them will end up in private practice and probably won't do high degree research.
Yeah.
But anyway, that doesn't mean I can't go and complicate and trouble things. And so this idea of, you know, building relationships and alliances, and expanding your facilitation roles into different sectors through the work that you're already doing, that you've got the foundations for. And yeah, there might be areas of specialist expertise and things, but you know, you've got those skill sets.
I love how this stream just became a beaver pep talk.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I can't help myself. Sorry.
And I think it's all transferable.
Are we still in the time frame? Or was that?
I was gonna say we're. I know you have to leave soon, Paul.
Oh no.
Like
we
'cause
have
it is
talked for
currently
an hour and
20
40
to 8.
minutes. Yeah.
We have been talking for an hour and 40 minutes.
Oh, we have gone over time. Okay, we can edit that out. No, it wasn't a pep talk. It was just I'm just saying. It was a provocation. The point I'm making.
because you like actually inspired me, so now I'm like, oh,
Well,
that was
because
a pep talk.
but this is this sort of discussion about people with different levels of experience. So you've already got heaps of experience. I'm just saying, well, here's an example yet again. Here's another example of something that's already been incredibly successful. Yeah, it had problems with stuff in the same way that QAA also devolved, had problems with stuff, but that doesn't mean it's still not a useful example and that can be adapted and rethought. Australia was the leader in alternative, what was it called? The hydro, in the 1940s, leader of energy, what's the term? Can't think of the term. Renewable energy in the 1940s.
Yeah.
We were the world leader.
Snowy hydro, are you talking about?
And other things too.
Yeah.
There wasn't dehydration plants, but there were other things, desalination I should say. There were other things going on, but that was a big part of it. And we were the world leader for a really long time. And, you know, China I think is the current leader. But, you know, that doesn't mean we can't, you know, say, oh, let's look at these prior conditions of existence and what the technology was, what the thinking and understanding was, and let's update that to now, you know, which is what we're seeing with solar. Because, I mean, God, how much sun have we got?
Yeah.
Touch wood. As much as it might be humid and hot, and we're like, oh, God.
In your experience, your like timeline of working and being an artist, have you seen peaks and troughs in like when support for artists and that sort of optimism to make artist-led sectors were at their highest? And like, what were the conditions, do you think, around those optimistic peaks?
Changes of government.
Yeah.
Often. And arts policy too. I mean, you know, there was a lot of chat a long time about, you know, the term artist, and there's still many of my colleagues and younger colleagues will say the Artist Run Initiative was an artificial term imposed by the Australian Council.
Yeah.
And through arts policy.
It was in grant applications.
Yeah.
So when you were applying for a grant, you needed to indicate if you were like like sole trader independent artist, or if you were an institution, and then all these ARI Artist Run Initiatives didn't have a way of categorizing themselves, so the term Artist Run Initiative was introduced in the grant application as like a box you could tick.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a contested term. And it's,
it's institutional.
Well, it depends who you talk to in terms of how it's contested. But have you noticed in the new NAVA, or recent NAVA schedule of fees, the term artist-led organisations is used more than artist run initiatives in the language, in the communication in the language. So, you know, I mean, I think that's a good thing, but I think the problem is that if we're talking about strange, weird and unruly artist groupings, which when we're talking about Brisbane Artists, which is what I feel, that's my bias and prejudice, I guess. And even the ones that might, you know, have been sort of quasi-institutional are still, you know, quite hybrid. And I think that's wonderful. I think that's really different. A point of differentiation about here in Brisbane. And that has a ripple effect. What that ripple effect is, you could only assess through, you know, collecting data about, you know, what was the impact of doing this then, you know. And these are all research projects which haven't happened, and the opportunity, the timing around these things is disappearing. But I think, you know, through an archival lens, what's his name? Canadian archivist Terry Cook talks about He died, I think he died in 2015. Anyway, he wrote this thing about the 4 archival paradigms. And I just mention archives because he was talking about this idea that there's so much information and context and nuance now on and offline about like whatever you want to talk about in relation to archiving, that there's, you know, that it's, and that's what he emphasises the community. He calls it a community paradigm. I call it community mindset in my research. That idea of like, yeah, but what does a community value? What do they need to keep and retain and preserve and narrate? And then how do they then reinterpret that stuff? So what you're doing now, like in 5 years' time, you'll be. I mean, you're already reflecting on action and inaction as it is, because you've learned how to do that by running and managing and sustaining ARIs and operating them now. But then in 5 years' time, the accumulation of all that reflection, plus the reflection you might have in 5 years' time because of all this expertise and all this non-ARI-like activity, which is this ongoing dialogue and dance, you'll reflect on all of that and what's going to unfold here, assuming we'll stay here, between now and 2032. To say 3032 is like, ooh. 2032, which sort of feels a bit like it could be 3032. But that's what government, corporates, commercials, the private sector is gearing up for. There will be commissions, there will be money available for artists. How do you leverage that? How do you access that? Where is the information about that? Well, who knows? It's probably in the private sector. Anyway, that's lovely. Just... I was just thinking about this idea of, you know, Peter Anderson's exhibition looked at sort of Commonwealth Games in 1982, at World Expo in 1998. This is for Ephemeral Traces exhibition at the University of Queensland Art Museum. He really wanted to talk about that sort of internationalising stuff that was happening through infrastructural activism, which is a term that Terry Smith talks about. And, you know, really useful framework for an exhibition. But another reason, and talk about starting points and the good, the bad and the ugly, for me, that was really great, and I was a really important part of that whole, you know, lead up and development and conversations and stuff with lots of people. That's how the Facebook page started. That's how ARI Remix started. But I was like, yeah, but all of this other stuff happened, and it didn't just stop in 1988. In fact, I know from my experience how many things evolved because of all the stuff that happened between 1982 and 1998. In the same way that, you know, look at what, you know, I mean, when did you start the laundry, for example?
It would have been 2014.
So that's...
And then we ran it for 3-4 years. But
10 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very old now.
No, I was going to say you're very... Well, no, I wasn't going to say that. I was going to say you're very experienced. What did you learn in 3 years? Like a lot.
Yeah.
So much.
You know,
you have to learn how to swim, basically. You throw it in the deep end.
Yeah.
It is a marathon.
Yeah.
So, you know, the good, the bad and the ugly. Optimism is a mobilising force. Anger's mobilising. You know, there's lots of emotions that are mobilising. And then how do you maintain and sustain them through these sorts of conversations?
Yeah, because when it doesn't work, it can be profoundly demobilising too. So
yeah. But that's like life, you know, it's that there's the ebbs and the flows, you know, the ocean comes in, the ocean goes out. And then there's this in between. Anyway, getting very philosophical.
Yeah,
that's
lovely.
So many good takeaways. So
warm.
start an ARI.
Well,
trouble things, complicate things.
Yeah.
And your ARI.
Think about how your ARI's going to end.
You don't have to think about your exit strategy when you start an ARI, but I just bring it up because I remember I'm bringing it up because I did a small business course in RMIT many years ago, and you know, all these students from all parts of the world in RMIT in Melbourne, you know, starting their small businesses, great business ideas. And the first question, they said, "Hi, welcome everyone. This is the course we're doing over the next 6 weeks." It was a niche course, and you might think we're going to start with how you start a business, but we're going to start with something else. And everyone's going, "Are we in the right class? Is this, you know?" And the lecturer said, "We're going to start with how do you exit a business." My God, what a provocation that was. And no one knew how to answer it. Oh, people tried. So I've always remembered that because It's like the you know, so, and for artists it's really important because you're developing all of this intellectual property along the way. Yeah, there's shared activity and collectivizing around this, that, and the other, and one, you know, and but the intellectual property that you developed is often shaped and informed by that activity. Not always, but often it does, and so it's important to think about those sorts of things. And what does it look like when you do exiting? You know, so I just mention it as a thing. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
You're just a wealth of information, and we're so glad to have you here, and to, like, anybody curious about ARIs, you're the person to know. So I'm really glad, like, if they didn't already know you, that they could meet you through this.
Yeah,
and
I hope
come
it's been.
talk to us.
I hope it's been illuminating, because I think you know, to be really honest and to be critical, sort of self-critical, is that we sometimes forget. You know, like, here's an example. I wanted to ask you at the beginning of today, how do you pronounce Artist Run Initiative in its abbreviated form?
ARI.
And how? Yeah.
A lot of people say ARI.
I had a really lovely partner who was not in the arts while I was running ARIs, and I'd take him to all these ARIs, and he was too like embarrassed to ask what an ARI was, and then he'd just like listen to it, and he's like, RE, it's a residential exhibition.
Oh,
ARI.
I love
A
that.
And I was like,
I love that so much.
Yeah, but when you Google RE, it's interesting what you come up with too, actually. But anyway, but you know, like we sometimes assume and take for granted that people know what we're talking about,
yeah.
and so, and I, you know, I'm, you know, in this situation where there's sort of shared knowledge and prior knowledge and current knowledge, you know, I don't have maybe the current knowledge that you've got about what's on the ground now. I've got a sense of it. But I think, you know, for people, and that's, I mention this because of the burnout thing, when you're having conversations with people who may be non-arts based, I think that sort of democratizing role that we play is really important, because you want to be accessible. You know, you want to let people know what we're doing, because it really matters. How do you frame that? How do you talk about that? What language do you use? Those sorts of things are part of the challenge of having an ARI.
It's one thing your work does so beautifully, is like letting artists know that they matter and what they do really matters.
Yeah, we do matter.
Yeah, a lot of people don't, a lot of people start and end an ARI without anyone really kind of saying that, I think. So, like, you just kind of do it implicitly through your work by treating it as important enough to archive.
Well, you know, look at Beaver. Thank you. That's a great thing to say. But also, like, I just see this is ongoing work. This doesn't stop. You don't stop. You know, I've got friends who retire, and it's like, you know, I will never. I mean, I will retire when I drop dead, as an artist. I mean, you don't stop being. Oh, I don't. Well, yes, you can consciously and intentionally stop being an artist, but you know, you might pick it up, or you may not pick it up another time. But you know, generally, as an artist, you don't retire. It still shapes and informs what you do, and the work that you're doing. Say there comes a time in 10, 20 years' time, whatever it is, whatever the figure is, when you're like, oh no, Beaver's done, you know, it might never be done, it might just shift form. It might stop, but it might shift form. Artworkers Union of Queensland became the Queensland Artworkers Alliance. All the ARIs, all the artist run spaces that we ran in Brisbane then merged at some point, not all of them, but most of them. We run a group together called Bureau Art Space, where we're like, no, we have to pool our resources, pool our expertise. And it was really, we just did it for 6 months. It was great. Anyway, we could do
we could do this
Well,
for
we
another
won't.
hour.
and even
thank you
even
so
August has settled down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it takes a whole podcast for it to chill out. Sorry about your shoelaces.
That's okay.